Okay, good morning, everybody. You're very welcome. Thank you very much for joining online. You're welcome to the first of what is a two-part series on the topic of aging in time, demography, life cycles, and policy development. My name is Maurice McCorrig. I'm Professor of Politics and Public Policy in Queen's University, Belfast, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Royal Irish Academy's Social Sciences Committee. And with two other colleagues from that committee, Professor Cathal O'Donoghue, who's the Chair of Social and Public Policy at University of Galway, and Colette Bennett, who's Director of Advocacy and Research at the Wheel. We are creating or organising these two events. So we're really pleased that you're able to join us here today. This first one is about the topic of ageing in public policy. And we're going to look at the public policies associated with ageing and how it crosses across different policy sectors. So changing demographics, health, income adequacy, housing, and so on, as well as issues around the macroeconomic position of the country in terms of capacity to support quality of life as we age, and tying these things in a consistent and coherent way, because life expectancy is developing at such a pace that, extraordinary as it may sound, children born today might live to have good expectation to live to 21, 24. So how do we plan for that? We have a number of excellent speakers, which you'll hopefully have seen on the programme, and I'm going to hand over to the first of them in a minute, to Karina Doorley from the Economic and Social Research Institute. Before I do, just to say, if anybody has questions as we go along, please put them into the Q&A chat, and I'll field them to the speaker at the very end. We'll also offer an opportunity for a minute or two at the end of each speaker's presentation to ask directly a question. Otherwise, if you want to hold on to those questions, we'll have a half-hour session at around 12 o'clock to discuss each or all of the presentations that have been presented. So it promises to be very rich and very interesting seminar this morning, and as I say, really pleased you could join us for it. And without any further ado, I guess I will hand over to Karina Doorley from the Economic and Social Research Institute. So Karina, is that okay? The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Maurice. Delighted to be here. I'm just going to share, and hopefully this will work. Can you see that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks very much. So my name is Karina Doorley. I head up the Tax, Welfare and Pensions team at the Economic and Social Research Institute. So obviously the topic of ageing is very high on our agenda. And one of the tools that we use in a lot of our analysis, a lot of the work that we do in terms of evaluating public policy is microsimulation. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of how microsimulation can help to guide public policy, and I'm going to particularly focus on public policy to do with ageing. So very briefly, I'll start with what is microsimulation, and then I'm going to give you two very brief examples of how the tool can be used to evaluate, firstly, the effect of policies on the older population, so the effect of policy change on the ever-growing population of older people, and then secondly, how to use it to evaluate a policy that is directly targeted at the fact that we have an aging population in this country. Okay, so firstly, if we start with what is microsimulation. So microsimulation is a tool that's used to evaluate what-if scenarios, so hypothetical scenarios that you can't use historic data to find the answer to. So typically those questions are related to the direct tax and welfare system, but not always. And what microsimulation does essentially is link the rules of the tax and welfare system, so the rules of a particular country in a particular year, to representative survey data for that year, or indeed to administrative data for that year, to allow researchers or policymakers to estimate the cost and then the impact. And by distributional impact, I mean who are the winners and who are the losers are implemented. So imagine you have this representative survey of the population. So you've got data that represents what the population structure looks like for a particular year. You also have all of the rules of the tax and welfare system coded up. What you can do is simulate how much each family should pay in tax and should receive in welfare based on their observable characteristics like labour income, but also on the household characteristics like the presence of children or the age of the members. And what that allows you to do then is say, well, okay, these are the current rules, but what happens if we change the rules, right? So we can simulate changes to policy and look at how they affect particular family types, low versus high income households, or indeed how much revenue they generate for the government. So the switch microsimulation model is a tool that's been used in Ireland for many decades now. So it was developed at the ESRI in the late 1980s. And I think as microsimulation models go, that makes it quite a mature model. It's not quite elderly yet, but it's certainly mature. And switch models direct tax and welfare in Ireland. It also models many non-cash benefits, so things like medical cards and childcare subsidies. And it also models indirect taxes, so VAT and excise. The way the model works is it's developed and housed at the ESRI, but access is granted to government departments based on a funding agreement. So that means that those government departments have access to this model when they're conducting their own sort of budgetary evaluation. So they can check in advance of deciding something for a particular budget, what the cost and distributional impact is. And it's been used in-house and for governmental distributional impact assessment for over 30 years now. So at the moment, it's being used by 5 government departments and by the Parliamentary Budget Office. And I suppose one of our more important contributions to policymaking in Ireland is our post-budget briefing. So 3 days after the budget every year, we publish a post-budget distributional impact assessment, in which we evaluate the effect of the budget on government revenues, but also on the distribution of income at the household level. Okay, so that's exactly what I'm going to show you now. I'm going to show you the results from our most recent post-budget analysis. So the budget happened at the beginning of this month, and a couple of days later, we published this analysis where we look at what the distributional effect of budget 2025 is compared to a wage index 2024 budget. And all that means is that we're comparing the changes to tax and welfare systems to a scenario in which the 2024 system had simply grown in line with expected wage growth between 2024 and 2025. So it allows you to look at the real change in income that can be expected from the budgetary changes. So I won't go into great detail on this. So this is just the main measures that we were able to analyze. So you'll see that we kind of cover all the major categories: income tax. We're able to look at the bands and credits increase, the USE changes, PRSI increases, and so on. In terms of welfare, we modelled the personal rate of benefits increasing by €12 across the board, plus a variety of other changes to the welfare system. We also modelled all of the one-off policies, which have been a feature of this and the last number of budgets, and which have become very important actually in terms of income adequacy for many families. We can model non-cash benefits. So we looked at the introduction of free school books at senior secondary cycle. And then on the indirect tax side, we had tobacco excise increases, carbon tax, and then the return to full excise on petrol and diesel, and the 13.5% VAT rate on gas and electricity. Okay, so in this chart, the y-axis here, the vertical axis shows the percentage change in disposable income for families as a result of budget 2025, compared to a scenario in which the 2024 tax and welfare system had simply kept pace with wage growth. And I've divided the population here into equally sized groups, 10 equally sized groups, ranging from the lowest income decile to the highest income decile. So on the left, you have the lowest income group, and on the right, you have the highest income group. And this chart shows just the effect of the permanent changes to the tax and welfare system. So we're comparing the 2025 permanent tax and welfare system to the 2024 permanent tax and welfare system. The blue bar shows the effect of direct tax and welfare, so that's income tax, USC, etc., and then welfare. And the grey bar shows indirect tax, which is VAT and excise. And then the two together give the white dots, which are the total effect of the budgetary package on household incomes. So the pattern here is broadly progressive. So that means that low-income households are gaining slightly more from budget 2025 than high-income households. And that's largely due to the direct tax and welfare system, with the indirect tax changes actually resulting in income losses, which are higher for lower income families. So what happens then when we look at the temporary and permanent changes together? Well, we get a slightly less progressive picture. So the lowest income decile is still gaining more than the other income deciles. But the next 4 deciles, so decile 2 to 4 are actually, 2 to 5 even, are actually seeing very little income change or even a drop in income as a result of Budget 2025. And then the higher income households see gains as a result of Budget 2025. And that's largely because these are the groups that are benefiting from tax cuts, which don't really have much of an impact at the bottom of the income distribution. So we next looked at the effect of the budget by household type. So we've divided the population into different types of households. So depending on whether they're working age or they have children or not. So let me just draw your attention to the retirement age households. So we've got a single retirement age category and a retirement age couple category. And these are actually the groups that are likely to lose out as a result of Budget 2025 compared to a wage index 2024 scenario. And that's true whether we look at permanent versus permanent or whether we include the temporary measures as well. And the reason for this is that most of the elements in the welfare system were increased by in or around wage inflation between 2024 and 2025. Two exceptions are the fuel allowance and the living alone allowance, which are predominantly targeted at older households and which were frozen in nominal terms. So that actually resulted in real income losses for those households because those payments were not keeping pace with wage inflation. And the other thing to notice there is that when we look at the permanent and temporary system together, you can see quite substantial losses for retirement age households. And that's because these groups are, so the fact that the energy credit decreased between 2024 and 2025, so it was, I think, 400 and down to 250 in 2025, that actually affects retirement age households more than the other types of household because they aren't benefiting from other increases in the temporary system, such as the double child benefit payment and so on. So that impacts those households more than others, particularly because they're more likely to have fixed incomes. So any sort of change to things that come through the welfare system really impacts them because they don't have earnings to fall back on and wage growth to benefit from. Okay, and then the last thing we looked at when we were looking at Budget 2025 was its effect on poverty rates. So if you look at the column on the right-hand side first, if we exclude temporary measures from Budget 2025, so these energy credits and double welfare payments, etc., the proportion of elderly households at risk of poverty would be 18%, which is higher than the relevant proportions for adults, working age adults, or for children. So, you know, that puts elderly poverty at higher risk of poverty, elderly households at higher risk of poverty than other groups. When we include the temporary measures, that number drops to 13%. So temporary measures are having a really, really substantial impact on the living standards of the elderly population. And that sort of leads to concerns, if you like, about what's going to happen to that group when these measures are withdrawn, as they inevitably will be at some point, either next year or the year after. Okay, so our conclusions from this, I'll just ask you to focus on the last two here, which relate to the elderly population. So the reduction in the energy credits and the freezing of the fuel allowance and the living alone allowance affected those of retirement age and those with disabilities more than other groups, and actually resulted in real income losses for them. And we also expect the poverty rate of these groups to rise once temporary measures are withdrawn, which sort of begs the question how policymakers are going to make up for this loss in temporary payments for households who have actually become dependent on them, such as elderly households and indeed households with disabilities. Okay, so that was our analysis of Budget 2025 with reference to elderly households. Another sort of recent piece of work that we did that was more related, if you like, to policies related to population ageing was an analysis of the effect of increasing PRSI to fund the state pension. So the state pension system is at risk due to population ageing. I mean, we're not alone in Ireland in that scenario. Many developed countries and European countries are also in this situation. Our state pension system is funded on a pay-as-you-go basis. So that means that the people in work today are paying the pensions of those who are retired today. And that works as long as the ratio of working age to pension age people stays at a certain level. but that ratio is set to decrease. So we're expecting it to be about 2.3% in 2051, down from 5 in 1991. So a very substantial decrease in the ratio of working age to pension age people. And there are really only a limited number of solutions to this problem. Okay, so we can either increase the state pension age, so we pay people later in life their state pension. We can reduce state pension payments, so we pay them less once they retire. We can increase social insurance contributions, so contributions into the social insurance fund, or we can make transfers to the social insurance fund directly from the exchequer. So those are broadly the policy solutions available. Government has sort of erred on the side of increasing pay-related social insurance. They've decided they're not increasing the state pension age. They haven't indicated any appetite for reducing state pension payments either. It's possible that there may be transfers to the social insurance fund in the future, but for the moment, government are focusing on increasing PRSI contributions. So we have this roadmap of increases to PRSI, which will happen between 2024 and 2028, which increases all rates of PRSI by a small amount incrementally over a 5-year period. And the first thing we looked at here was, well, how much is this actually going to raise? So in the first year, the increase is quite small. So in the region of €209 million per annum raised by these increases in PRSI. You'll notice that there's a slightly mitigating effect of welfare. So as PRSI goes up, certain groups of the population become eligible for slightly more welfare, or indeed become newly eligible for welfare. But by 2028, we estimate that compared to a scenario where there was no change to PRSI, the reforms would be bringing in around 1.6 billion per annum. So that's, you know, a kind of chunky amount that could go towards plugging this hole in the social insurance fund. We then looked at whether who the winners and losers are from the reform. So again, I've divided the population here into 5 equally sized groups, ranging from the lowest income quintile to the highest income quintile. And on the y-axis, you can see the percentage change in disposable income as a result of the reforms. So if you focus on the 2028 line here, so this is the cumulative effect of the reforms up to 2028. You see very little change in the bottom income quintile, so the lowest income households not really losing very much. And up to the highest income household, we've got income losses of about 1% of disposable income. Okay, so quite progressive in nature, impacting high income households more than low income households, which is exactly as you'd expect given their increased attachment to the labour market. There is a question about whether employers will pass on their PRSI increases to employees. So certain employers may not have room in their profit margins to be paying extra PRSI for their employees. So that may get passed on to employees in the form of lower wages. And there's good evidence from the international literature that increases like this do eventually get passed on, maybe not in full, but a large part of them would be passed on in the medium to long term. So this chart shows what would happen if employers pass the whole PRSI increase on to employees. And then you see the pattern is still progressive, but the income losses are larger, particularly for high income households. So what about the burden? Where does this fall in terms of the age profile of the population? So we estimate that it will affect those aged 25 to 54 more than the other age groups. So down the bottom, you have the 18 to 24-year-olds, which are slightly less affected, as are also the 55 to 64-year-olds and the 66 plus. So again, that's very linked to their labour market status and the fact that the younger and older groups are less likely to be in the labour market. And if they are in the labour market, they might be working fewer hours or earning less. We then finally, we looked at poverty rates. So if you look at the right-hand columns, where we have the full pass-through assumption. So this is the most dramatic assumption, if you like. And we find that the increase in PRSI rates over this whole time period will result in an increase in poverty rates of about 1/4 of a percentage point for the whole population. So that's a relatively small increase all in all. But where the effect is bigger is for the child population. So we've got a 0.42 percentage point increase in child poverty as a result of the reforms. And that's very much tied to the group that is most affected. So this 25 to 54-year-old group are also more likely to have children. So that's just kind of reflecting that. Okay, so then we sort of concluded by the, so first of all, if we look at the amount that these reforms are going to bring in the short to medium term, it might be enough, but given the deficit in the social insurance fund is going to grow exponentially, especially from 2035 onwards, it's not going to be enough in the long term. So more reform is likely to be needed. And at that point, we would want to consider the fairness of levying the burden on the same population. So that population of 25 to 54-year-olds who are currently in work. Other possibilities that were suggested by the Commission on Taxation and Welfare and the Commission on Pensions, among others, is levying PRSI on those aged 66 and over who are working, and equalising the treatment of employee and self-employed income, and putting the state pension age back on the table. So really none of them very palatable, but you know, given the trade-off between levying the whole burden on a particular group and going to these other alternatives, there probably is a case for considering them. Okay, so I'm done there. Just what I want you to take away from this, if possible, is that microsimulation modelling can be very useful for evaluating the effect of policy reform before it happens. And in particular here, I focused on evaluating the effect of age-related policy reform. It can also be useful in comparing alternative age-related policies. So if we have a suite of potential policies, we can compare their cost, their distributional impact, and, you know, make sort of deductions on how fair each are and what is the most efficient policy to proceed with. And then we can also evaluate the effect of other policy reforms. So, you know, our year-to-year standard budgetary reforms on the growing population of older households. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Karina. That was extremely clear and absolutely fascinating. And as a chair, I have to say you get a gold star for being well within time as well. So thank you. It's really excellent. I mean, the microsimulation, I'm a convert. That's brilliant. And the projections are absolutely fascinating as well. So thank you for preparing the slides and preparing your presentation. It's a brilliant way to start off this whole series, actually. So now I did say after every speaker, we'd have a minute or two that somebody might have an initial reaction or something they'd really like to ask Karina, which I'm sure she'll try to answer as best she can. So the floor is open if anybody wants to put up a hand or just to unmute and speak. You can do that. Now is the time to do it. If not, it's fine that we can hold off till the very end of the session this morning. Do I see any hands? I don't think anything's popping up there, no. So you have achieved the perfect presentation there, Karina. There's no questions whatsoever. I'm sure other things will come up during the course of the morning. So, oh, sorry, something's come in there in the Q&A, which I did say, well, I'll read it out just in case everybody can't see it. So super presentation. Thanks, Karina. Given that Ireland remains the only country in the Eurozone without an indexed pension, and with state pensions continuing to fall short of the 34% average earnings benchmark, what do you think is preventing our policymakers from committing to benchmarking or indexing the state pension? How can we address these barriers to ensure more predictable and sustainable financial security for older people, particularly those most vulnerable, like women with lower pension entitlements due to caregiving roles? Thank you very much, Alison. There's a lot in that, but it's a really meaty and a very appropriate question. So thanks. And there's actually a second question. Will I read that out as well, Karina? Is that right? It's actually about the method. Are microsimulation tools available for charities to use? So I guess that's like the switch model and so. So if you want to address the shorter one first, maybe.
Sure. So yeah, I can. The microsimulation tool. So the switch model is not freely available for people to use, and that's mostly down to data availability and the fact that some of the data is quite disclosive, so we have to be careful about results and things like that. The Euromod tool that's the harmonized microsimulation model for Europe, and there's an Irish component to it. That is available, so that's freely available for researchers to use. Now, I'm not sure if the particular charity has researcher status or conducts research, it might be possible to get access to that. Switch is actually based on the Euromod platform, as are a lot of country-specific models now, because it just makes it really easy to do cross-country and harmonized research. So I would suggest looking into the Euromod model and seeing if you can get access to that. It's a really useful tool.
That's I just intervene quickly. That's Patrick. Thank you, Patrick, for saying that. And he just mentions the supplemented the charity I work for is a HSE funded charity, so it might be behind a paywall. Patrick, I might suggest just to email Karina. Would that be okay? Yeah. And she could just pass on what she knows about it. And then the other question then from Alison, Karina,
So
are you okay?
that's a really interesting question, Alison.
Yeah.
So we don't index any part of our system systematically. So there are some countries where pensions are indexed, welfare is indexed, and even tax parameters and credits and bans and everything are indexed. We don't do any of that automatically. The cynic in me would say it's because, you know, the Minister for Finance likes getting up and doing the giveaway bit and saying, this is what I'm allocating for this year. Actually, so playing devil's advocate here, if you look back over the last like 30, 40 years, while we don't officially index anything in line with price or wage growth, in practice, that is what we have been doing. So our tax and welfare system has kept up with inflation and wage growth, and the pension system is included there. What indexing does, though, is give certainty to people. So they know that if prices increase, they are going to get a similar increase in their pension payment. So the fact that it's sort of on an ad hoc basis, and that one year it might go up by more than inflation and the next year it might go up by slightly less than inflation, gives a bit of uncertainty to households, particularly those that dependent on fixed incomes like pensions or welfare payments. The advantage of not indexing is it allows government a bit more leeway to target specific groups, right? So if, you know, maybe and indeed there was a focus on pensioners in the 90s. Pensioner poverty was very high in this country in the 90s, and there was a focus on them then to bring their poverty rates down through increases to the state pension. So it does allow more financial leeway to focus on other groups. But it's true then that it leads to uncertainty. So I don't think there's a really correct way to do this, apart from the fact that, as we say every year when we do our post-budget analysis, when policymakers are comparing what they're actually doing, when they're evaluating the distributional effect of what they're doing, they should compare it to a benchmark that's indexed. So they see where the real gains and losses are. And maybe those are on target and then maybe they're not. So that would be my very long answer to that.
No, that's excellent. That's really interesting. Thanks. It's a very comprehensive answer to that as well. We might just draw a line there for the moment. Thank you to Alison and Patrick for the two questions. And we're just about, I think, a minute ahead of time, which is great. So thank you again, Karina, for the opening presentation. And we'll move on to my colleague and a fellow organizer, Professor Cathal O'Donoghue from the University of Galway. And Cathal, do you want to try and share your slides there and say hello to everybody? Let's see if that's all working.
Good morning, everybody.
Great.
Share.
I'll tell you now. Yep, that's working great. Cathal, so I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marish, and good morning, everybody. Thanks to my colleagues for co-organising this today. As a link to the previous speaker, I worked on that switch model a long time ago, over 30 years ago, on an earlier version of the model with DOS even before Windows. I'm part of the lineage that Karina has working on that model. My paper today is looking not so much at distributions across people with the population that Karina looked at, but rather looking at between generations. And I've authored this with colleagues Gizem Khan and Denise Soligon. So we're interested in intergenerational equity for lots of reasons. So how do we find it? It's kind of related to sustainability of well-being and look at the balance of well-being between generations over time. When we accumulate debt in the public sector, we're borrowing from future generations to pay for investments and expenditure now. From an intergenerational equity point of view, that might be justified because typically with economic growth, future generations are richer, but that may be at risk with things like climate change. So there might be a justification for intergenerational transfers. And we're also concerned about intergenerational equity via the build-up of pension liabilities. So we make promises of the future on the basis of social insurance contributions made in the past. and because it's a pay-as-go system, current expenditures pay for current retirees, and as the population grows, there's a concern about whether it's financially sustainable over time and between generations. And with climate change is clearly something that affects different generations. We're accumulating emissions in the atmosphere that might affect the living standards of people in the future. So it's really spun or put a spotlight on intergenerational balance and intergenerational issues. And so I'm going to look at intergenerational issues from the perspective of the welfare state, and particularly redistribution. So redistribution is what the state does to smooth living standards between people. Karina was looking at between rich and poor currently, between different age groups. In this study, I'm interested in looking at intergenerational redistribution. So looking at how much do generations gain or lose from the welfare state, so what they receive in terms of benefits and expenditures, and what they pay in terms of taxes and contributions. If we think about the intergenerational redistribution, our state pension system has that inbuilt, because it's a pay-as-you-go system, as I said, and it was developed reasonably late. So the first insurance pensions were in the 70s, and it was only extended to self-employed in the late 80s. And because it's pay-as-you-go, there were some minimum thresholds when they came in, but in general, earlier generations in receipt of a pension would gain more than later generations from pay-as-you-go pensions. I guess because it could take 40 years or more to accumulate contributions for a pension, and you want current generations to benefit rather than wait for gains in 40 years' time, as you would from a private pension. So the research question I have here today is looking at different birth cohorts since the foundation of the state. Which generations have gained the most over the life cycle from the welfare state? And we're kind of more or less at 100 years since the foundation of the state. It's a good time to look back. In terms of methodology, it brings together a number of different dimensions. So we're looking at different birth cohorts. We're interested in the demography of how many people were alive at different points over time. We're interested in public expenditure, and when I did this work in my PhD a long time ago, I sat in the basement of the LSE in dusty books and extracted numbers. And now the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council has a lovely, clean database that you can use of public expenditure going back to 1922. So it's a little bit easier to do these days. I also supplement it with social welfare data. We're interested in full life cycles, so we're not interested just in the history from the foundation state to the present. I think almost every generation that was born since the foundation of the state, there are still some people alive. So to look at a full life cycle, we need to look to the future as well, and we need to make some assumptions around future spending. And what we do is we allocate expenditure from each individual year by type across the generations that were alive at each time since 1922, using various assumptions, which I'll come back to in a second. And we make assumptions in the future that essentially the current expenditures continue in proportion to GNP per capita. And we make an assumption from generational accounting that the debt is repaid by future generations. But that's a strong assumption, and we'll come back to that later on. I mentioned the data sets. And so if we think over time, it's not just public policy that drives how the welfare state impacts individuals and impacts generations. So looking back over since 1998, so going back over 25 years or so, we see very significant volatility in employment rates. We had the financial crash, very quick and deep reduction in employment rates in the country, recovery. Then we had the coronavirus, where there was a lot of people out of work for a time. We changed the structure of our social welfare system. We increased health expenditure significantly at that point. And then we recover, employment recovers, but we have a cost of living crisis where we have introduced measures to support people's standard of living because of higher prices relative to wages. And so even the last 20 years, we've had 3 major crises, but they've all been different. So different crises are different. In lots of ways, both in terms of policy design and in terms of how we pay for things. So austerity in the financial crisis meant we raised taxes to cut expenditure. In the coronavirus crisis, we were able to borrow, interest rates were low, we spent. And the instruments, the impact, the nature of impact on incomes is different. So different dimensions affect standard of living at different points. And so crisis may result in intergenerational redistribution even if there was no change in policy. So it's one of the factors that influence changes. People live through different periods, and so there are period, age and cohort effects over time, and these will influence how people interact with the welfare state. During times of higher unemployment, there'll be more benefit expenditures. When there's more old people, there'll be more health and pension expenditures. During upturns, there'll be more taxes paid. So this graphic here on the left takes the age-specific employment rate for males. Over time, I also have the data for females from various data sets going back to the late 80s. And I track, the early mid-90s, the Living in Ireland survey and the Survey of Income and Living Conditions. And we tracked at different ages the employment rate of different birth cohorts from 1940 up to 2000. And we see here that this big dip is the financial crisis. We see the impact at different stages in the life course of the financial crisis. And we were a poor country before the 90s. We had higher unemployment in the 80s, quite deep unemployment for a long time. And so there can be historical scarring effects, which we can observe in earlier cohorts relative to later cohorts. When we compare individual birth cohorts, the 1980 cohort was worse than 1990 or 1970 in early career, and 1970 cohort was higher than an earlier cohort. So the 1990 and 1970 cohort has done reasonably well from a labour market point of view. And so one of the questions is, do these periods balance out? We're not looking at income in this study, but rather net expenditure from the state. So we're going to look at that now in a minute. If we want to allocate expenditures and taxes across the distribution, we need to look at the pattern of expenditures by age over time. So these bars here are age groups from young to old, for benefits per person, for taxes per person, and the net gain, the difference between the two. So there are different needs at different parts of the life cycle, kind of like Rowntrie's intergenerational study. During the childbearing period and later in life, you have more expenditure. These are just benefits. You have higher, as we'll see in a second, higher education expenditures at this point. During the working age, we have more taxes, and then during pension age, we have more pension benefits, for example. So the welfare state expenditures reflect these different needs across the life course. Policy has changed over time. So we have a Beveridgean model, mainly anti-poverty focused, although we had in the past a light earnings replacement unemployment benefit and disability benefit, that's been reintroduced again more recently. So but we don't have an earnings related state pension. Policy isn't constant over time, both in terms of generosity, structure, in terms of coverage for different needs, and also for demand from the macroeconomy. So this graphic here describes the generosity of two benefits, the unemployment benefit and the old age assistance benefit over time, expressed as a percentage of the average wage. So we see a significant increase in generosity up to the 90s, a decline around the financial crisis, and as wages fell, generosity increased, and it's kind of flatlined and started to decline again as wages increase in the recovery. So there's quite significant change in coverage, and also change in generosity over time. When we look at the public expenditure, E, and taxes over time, expressed as a percentage of GNP, we see a big increase in the state, in the size of the state, from the 60s up until the 80s, and then it fell back as with the Celtic Tiger, and we cut taxes, except for this big spike here when we bailed out the banks in the financial crisis. This spaghetti graphic, it's really, I guess you can't really take that much from it. I mean, this is the population per cohort, and normally, if you look at a population pyramid on the side, populations start at a particular rate and then decline over time. But immigration can have an impact, or migration can have an impact. And we see increases in immigration, and it's always been really, really important in Ireland. Historically, emigration, and more recently immigration, which actually makes it very hard to do demographic projections because there's such volatility. We also see decline in fertility rate between 1978 and 1995. We see improvements in mortality that's slow, and we're making projections. We use the CSO projections. So the largest birth cohort was 2009, and it looks likely that there's going to be significant immigration as well. It's because of the 1980 birth cohort was so big birth cohort, even with lower fertility, results in a very big birth cohort, and we see that in schools at the moment, and in universities. We're going to see it shortly. So the conclusion from the spaghetti is that different generations are quite different. So there's when you look at, and when you add it all together, this is the dependency ratio, the ratio of elderly and children relative to working age. Historically, our dependency ratio was due to so much children we had, and that's declined over time. We have had low elderly dependency ratios because a lot of our elderly migrated in the 50s and 60s, but that's going to rise, and it started to rise. And when you combine the two, we're relatively uniquely low dependency ratio at the moment, but that will rise rapidly, putting pressure on the welfare state. And the elderly part of the welfare state has a greater impact on cost and expenditure than the child one, just given the distribution of public expenditures. So now I'm going to start to look at the cumulative expenditure of different welfare state items per survivor per cohort. So for the number of people in that cohort over time. And so this is education. It starts off at zero. There's not much expenditures at the very start. Then it rises, and what we see, and then levels out after university. So we see a lot of between cohort variation, with a trend of increasing education expenditure per cohort member per cohort until 1971 cohort, and then that fell back. And so this is a product of two factors: increasing expenditure per student and rising student numbers. If we look at the next one, health, is a different pattern. Lower expenditure earlier in life. We assign maternity to the mother rather than the child, and so we have that pattern, and we have different expenditures per cohort. So healthcare expenditure rose very quickly from the late 60s to 1975, going from 2% to 6%. Therefore, the longer a cohort lived after this change, the higher the net benefit they will have. Looking at social protection, we see it rising spend per cohort up to 1951, then the rising spend per cohort from the early 60s until the 90s. With increased demand for expenditure in the 80s, but that fell back. So in later cohorts, the demand is more from higher childcare benefits, but lower working age expenditures, because there's less demand. The unemployment rate is lower for working age expenditures. Whereas for pension expenditures, which is very important in the welfare state, we have now a growing pensioner population, and we had a growing rate per recipient into the 1990s, expressed as a percentage of GNP. And then lastly, taxation is concentrated during the working career. And we have a number of different trends. Income taxes were very low up until the 70s, really, with marginal rates increasing until actually until the early 80s. And then there was a rapid expansion. Yeah, there was a gradual increase until 65, then a rapid expansion after 65 until the mid 80s. And then there was a number of tax reforms. So the top marginal tax rates fell back, and they've stayed more or less static for the last quarter of a century. So later cohorts will pay higher taxes, partially because of the higher marginal tax rates, but also because of the higher wages and the benefit from economic growth that later cohorts have seen. And then when we add it all together, we get this N-shaped curve. So younger people in each cohort benefit from the welfare state. This is the cumulative effect. And as they enter the labour market, it turns, and it starts to go negative. And kind of by middle age, the cohorts are negative. And then it turns as we head towards retirement with more pension expenditures, more healthcare expenditures. And then some generations have had net benefits. This is the point to the present. So to get full cohorts, we need to project it out on the basis that current policies continue and that debt runs down. And we see, in terms of per survivor, a different net distributional outcomes per cohort. Now it's hard to read this, again, more spaghetti. So this is a graphic expressed per cohort in terms of the net gain and the components of taxes, social welfare, health, education, and other expenditures. And so if we look at the trend, we see the very foundation of the state had a higher net benefit that fell to a net cost in 1951 cohort, that grew back up until my birth cohort, 1971 cohort, and then is gradually falling as later cohorts. They have higher. They live in a if the world continues as present in a better economic climate, so they end up paying more taxes relative to their benefits over time. The extent of the net gain depends. It does depend a good bit on how we handle debt, and we just have one debt assumption here. So future work will look at a debt assumption. I think it's fair to say it will decline, but the full net decline will depend upon the assumptions we make about the future. So that's for future work. So our take-home message: generational accounts, which is a common tool, compares current generation with future generations. This method that we draw upon John Hill's work helps us to look at full lifetimes. So not just imagining the world now, we look at also the history of public expenditure. We knew that the welfare state has grown over time, and the tax system has grown over time. We know that there's been big economic changes. Employment rates grew since the 1990s. And we know that dependency ratios have changed and life expectancy is growing. So there's lots of drivers. In terms of intergenerational redistribution over time, we see the net benefit to generations increase, peaking in the early 1970s before falling back. But as I said, the impact on later cohorts will depend upon what we assume about debt. Do we repay it, or will we continue at the present? So that's it for me. Thanks very much for your attention. No idea how long I spoke for, but I guess I've already gone over. Thank you.
Oh, that's excellent. Again, thank you so much, Cathal. And it's a really nice presentation following on, I guess, from Karina's. And I should have said, sorry, as well as being a member of the working in the Economic and Social Research Institute, Karina's a member of the Royal Irish Academy's Young Academy. But you know, that projection forward, it's great to have this kind of longitudinal historical perspective. And as someone who's also tried to do a database on the Irish state, I sympathise with the dusty books in in my case, in the National Archives. But It's fantastic, and just to put the present in a bit of perspective, and also thinking about this wider longitudinal perspective, as I say. So, thank you very much, Cathal. There was two kind of observations, I think, rather than questions. It's fair to say there in the chat, just from Damon Matthew Wise, just about HSE funded bodies, even charities for people with disabilities, not receiving indexed increases. And yeah, just the effects of the 2008 financial crisis. We hear a lot of that from the community voluntary sector about the kind of the serious consequences, I guess, of the austerity years still not fully unwinding. But thank you for all the work, Cathal, and for intellectually, like being behind the idea, I guess, for today about the importance of aging in public policy. Now, I know Roseanne is gearing up there for the next presentation. We do have a minute or two if anybody would like to just unmute or put up a hand to ask a question. Actually, you would call yourself.
Yeah, just on the previous point.
Yeah.
In this one, we've looked at the full population, but there are different subgroups in the population. I think it'd be quite interesting to look at these intergenerational effects on different dimensions, like, for example, gender. Is there a different gender trend in terms of net benefits? And also to extend it to other aspects of intergenerational welfare, including incomes and housing costs and housing wealth. One could extend this type of analysis. It's addressing a little bit of the concerns for some subgroups. The disability is a little bit difficult because if we're looking at cohorts, people have health issues at different stages of their life course or from birth. That may be difficult to classify a cohort in that way, but it would be interesting to consider, or maybe even just to zoom in on particular aspects, particular parts of the life cycle, where there may be higher or lower incidence of different disabilities or ill health.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Cathal. As I don't see any other questions coming up there, and that's fine, and we're just a little bit ahead of time. Again, we'd allocated sort of 25 minutes for each of the first three speakers here. I guess Roseanne is very promptly lining up there, as I say. So, Roseanne, thank you very much for your time. Professor Roseanne Kenny is Chair of Medical Gerontology at Trinity College Dublin, and also the founding principal investigator of the Irish longitudinal study on aging, TILDA, which will be very well known to many of us on the call here. So thank you very much for your time, Roseanne, and I can see you. So if you want to share if you've slides, that is, or maybe you
no, I have actually, yeah.
Great. Do you want to try and share, and I'll let you know? That's
certainly.
Yeah, excellent. That's working perfect. So
thank you.
The virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Murish. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you. I've heard the previous speakers; they were wonderful, and they kind of set the scene. Although what I'm speaking to is a little bit different. I'm going to focus on aging in the context of health and policy issues with respect to that. And the theme is mind the gap, and that'll become more apparent as I speak. Yeah, so this has been alluded to already, but I think it's nice to just reflect on the percentage increase in population, those over 65, particularly in Ireland, here, the yellow line, compared with the EU average over 65. So we are the fastest aging country at the moment in the EU 27. And relatively, and again, this has been touched on earlier, there is a decline projected up to 2042 in the percentage of our population under 18 compared to over 65, which is dramatically going to increase from 833 now-ish up to 1.3 million, for example, over 65 in 2042. And relatively, the biggest increase will be in those 75 and older. And from the perspective of provision of health and social care, this is the group that will require most focus by those departments in the context of older persons. Now, there are three definitions I want to clarify before proceeding. The first is lifespan, the maximum number of years an individual can live. So it's unique to everybody. And this lady here will be familiar to you, Jean-Louise Calment. She lived to 122 and a half years, almost. And so that's how long we, our mammal species, could live to. I'm not sure that any of us, speaking or listening, will achieve that record. But nonetheless, that is potentially what we can achieve. That compares with expectancy, which is the average age an individual can expect to live at different stages. And this is mostly what we refer to, what has been discussed previously, and what I'll be speaking with. For example, a woman in Ireland who hits 65 can expect on average to live another 21 years, and a man another 18.5 years. That's life expectancy. But the big perspective, I think, certainly from the area of policy that I'm most engaged with, which is health and social care support, is health span. And that's the number of years someone is healthy without chronic or debilitating diseases. And, you know, there have been surveys done to say, well, what are people's expectations of getting older? And the two things we want as we age, I want to be mobile, I want to be moving to the very end, and I want my memory, my marbles. And if we have memory and mobility, we perceive ourselves as aging well, as aging healthily. But of course, all of the disorders and diseases that I as a clinician would encounter underpin facilitating memory and mobility. But nonetheless, it's no harm in being aware that they're the two things that motivate individuals. And of course, TILDA, the longitudinal study, does afford us in Ireland an opportunity to unpack the underpinning drivers of health span, data, the new oil. And I'll explain a little bit about what TILDA is very quickly, just to share some of that depth with you. It is a longitudinal study, which means we revisit the same people over a protracted period of time. It is one of the Health and Retirement Survey, or family of surveys or studies, which is focused on the aging process and the implications of aging at national levels. There are now 28 countries who have studies similar to the TILDA study. We piloted the study between 2006 and 2009 because the Irish, the research infrastructure actually was significantly lacking a number of capacity and infrastructural domains which would enable a longitudinal study. So there had to be a lot of new development in that context to allow a study like TILDA to take place in Ireland, but that's happened now. And the study is an omnibus study. So we collect information on a host of different aspects, because how we experience aging and those two aspirations of mobility and memory, they actually don't occur in isolation. A host of other experiences shape how we eventually age. Genes, of course, nutrition, of course, but family networks, social participation, education, household structure, marital status, work and retirement, income and assets, mental health and health, all influence the experience of aging and therefore feed into policy, into novel research, of course. And the way that we've designed the study, it is comparable with the 27, 28 other international aging studies, which are applying the same model of data collection, so that there is a global footprint. And actually, just in that context, we have been designated the WHO Collaborating Centre now for longitudinal studies in aging and the life course, because of course we don't just start to suddenly age, and I'll repeat this a few times during the presentation. We don't just suddenly age at, say, 60, 65, 70. It's an accumulative process. We work closely with the ESRI actually to enable collection of this data. People over 50 in Ireland were identified through a national, were targeted by a national representative sampling framework using the Irish Geodirectory, randomizing the addresses in Ireland, and then actually cold calling on almost 26,000 households to ascertain if anybody 50 or older lived there, because that was one of the infrastructural deficits. There wasn't a coupling that we could approach as a research study of address and age. So we had to actually just randomly select addresses and then identify whether anyone in the household was 50 or longer, and whether they would take part in a longitudinal study. The response rate to that was 62%. And at wave one of the study in 2009, 2010 was that data sweep, the cohort represented 1 in 156 people over 50 in Ireland. So that's quite good. 8,500 people. There are 3 forms of data collection. First of all, there's a face-to-face interview in the home, computerized, and TILDA was the first study which utilized this. So we had to develop this and train surveyors in Ireland to apply this face-to-face interview process in the home. And that's evolved as the study has evolved. But of course, and also it's evolved as our engagement with stakeholders has evolved, because there are issues with each wave which are pressing either from a policy perspective or from an NGO perspective that we can incorporate into new waves. So the questions can vary, but the core data is always the same because of the longitudinal nature of the study, and therefore the necessity for understanding process through longitudinal data accumulation. Participants also complete a self-completion questionnaire. Now that's for more personal, discrete information or data, some income data, for example, relationship data, for example. And then there's a face-to-face health assessment in a health assessment, designated health assessment suite. At the moment, that's in Trinity. At the first wave, we held it in Trinity and in Cork in order to facilitate participants, but a significant number of participants in the Cork area and Limerick and Kerry area actually elected to come to Dublin for the health assessment. And when we piloted this, we ascertained that it was more reasonable for the study, financially reasonable and feasible for participants to travel to Dublin, and for us to make that easy for them. We have a very, very good response rate with that process. Actually, it's over 85% for almost each of the health waves. And just to give you some sense of the structure of the study, at wave one, the first sweep of data, which was in 2009 through to 2011, the end of 2010, there was a health assessment, as I've described it, self-completion questionnaire and a CAPI. And then 2 years later, we didn't do a health assessment. The health assessment is only every 4 years, or in this case, every 6 years, a 6-year gap. But that's because it's a much more expensive component of the study, and we're able to embed some simpler health measures, timed up and go, or grip strength, etc., in the home, so that the surveyors can actually apply those measures in the home in these between health wave sweeps. And so the study's been going every 2 years. We refreshed the sample here at wave 6. And as the study has evolved, we've collected, and this is why the study is valuable data, the new oil, but in this context, the oil is the depth of phenotyping which is carried out in the study. So blood samples are taken at the same time as all of these measures so that we understand genetics, obviously, but newer measures of biological aging, like epigenetics and telomeres and metabolomics. I won't go into those, but I'll touch on epigenetics later on, because they're probably the most sensitive measures of the biological pace of aging, as opposed to your number, your age, your chronological age. Epigenetics measure your actual biological aging, and then repeated epigenetics give us a sense of the pace of aging. So we have a concept of the difference between biology and aging for individuals and groups. And we've taken hair samples. You can actually measure quite a lot of hormones with hair, particularly stress hormones, and stool samples for microbiome, which is very topical now in terms of nutrition. During COVID, we measured salivary samples and have very good measures of exposure to COVID, SARS-CoV-2 antibodies in saliva, as well as antibodies to other virus exposure throughout the lifetime. So that just gives you some sense, and the study is now supported right through to 2030. And to give some benefits of a longitudinal process, which is representative like this, is actually understanding, and this is lovely work that was done when Anne Nolan was working with us in TILDA, on the policy changes and how they can impact on individuals, either socially, economically, or from a health perspective. So in wave one in TILDA, that data was collected. And then there were a host of changes over this period of time between 2009 and 2013, where we were capturing data, including the fact that medical card entitlement for the over 70s was removed, if you remember, at the start of the financial crisis. And then we followed those who had lost medical cards and, for example, found that 2% lost the medical card. And for that cohort, GP visits reduced by 29%. But 13% gained a medical card during that period, and GP visits for that cohort increased by 43%. So it's not entirely clear what were the drivers behind this change, whether these were in fact sicker people or whether access to medical cards increased to some extent unnecessary visits, or whether all of these visits were necessary. We don't have that information. But that just gives you an idea of the value of these longitudinal data collections in the context of natural experiments, such as the financial crisis and the consequent policy changes as a result. Another example of that is the impact of the policy initiatives with respect to bituminous coal on respiratory disease, because we measure health measures and as well as self-reported health measures. We know that since the introduction, there has been a 3 to 5% reduction in bronchitis and emphysema, possibly related to the smoky coal ban over that 10-year period. Because of course, diseases like bronchitis or emphysema can take some time to be impacted by something like that. The study has informed a number of reports, topic reports and more extensive reports, and continues to do so, has been cited in 188 policy documents, 94 NGO documents. This is as of 2023, 191 times in Parliament, and we've presented to 2 Senate health committees. So there is an opportunity to certainly help to inform policy through the data. But what I'm most interested in sharing with you today is the importance of a mind the gap, which is the difference between lifespan, life expectancy, and healthy lifespan, and what our direction with respect to that is, because that, in my opinion, will be one of the most important reflections for policy going forward. And there is, and you'll see it all of the time in the media now, a huge emphasis on finding a cure for aging. I'm not in any way supporting this, but just this language is very much out there. There are billions as being pumped into research in this particular area. It is the case that manipulation of genes in mice can enable those animals to live longer by 25%. It's a long way off as yet, that work to translate into humans. But the issue is that age-related disorders, which impact ultimately on health span, actually very frequently begin their process early on in life. That's the first thing. And the second issue with this, finding a so-called cure for aging, is aging isn't a disease, it's a human process. And the assertions that it is a disease and something we can cure will have a lot of knock-on effects. And very simplistically, if you're a young doctor in an emergency department and an older person comes in and you buy in, or your institution buys into this concept of aging as a disease for which at the moment we don't have a cure, then you could put the case that that person may receive less favorable treatment because it's an incurable disorder that you're dealing with. So I think there are a whole lot of ramifications behind this, apart from the fact that it's inaccurate biologically. I'll show you why. So I said earlier on that some of the bloods that we were measuring can measure to a degree of accuracy biological aging, and that is the case. And this is probably the best clock, the Grim Age clock. Terrible name, but Grim Age clock, and I'll share that with you now, which helps to discriminate the difference between same chronological age, but biology of aging. Some people aging biologically more rapidly than others. And we know that there are a host of health behaviors which drive this, of course, but it's now quite topical to try to measure certain sites on the genes. Our genes are fixed. We can do nothing about our genes. We're born with those, but they probably only contribute to 25–30% of the biology of aging, of the aging process. So that's good news. That means there are factors which are controllable, environmental factors that we can control, which contribute to the remainder of our aging process, like smoking, like physical activity, like nutrition, like less stress, etc. And 1/3 of, so our genes are fixed, but there are areas on the genes which code for proteins in the cell, and they are the active energy piece of the gene, which are dynamic. They can change. And they're fundamental to the health and survival of each cell. And 1/3 of those sites which drive this information in the cell are related to aging. And so using an elastic net process, scientists have been able to identify a discrepancy in the sites which promote damage in cells, or the sites which promote adaptation in cells. And that residual implies faster aging. That this is what we can identify here, and correlates strongly with age and mortality. So that's what we mean when we say epigenetic clock, and that's how that concept has derived. But I just want to show you the importance of that biology in the context of social patterning of something like function, walking, mobility that people originally, that people claim they are most vexed on when aging, maintaining my mobility, and how that actually impacts on walking speed. So this is walking speed here, and this is social class. And we can see that indeed there is a strong relationship between, for example, take house ownership. If your house is worth more than 400, 200 to 400, less than 200, or you don't own your own home, and this is adjusted for all other factors which influence walking speed, you can see that there's a strong association between house value, for example, and walking speed, how quickly we walk. And walking speed is probably one of the strongest predictors for mortality. Similarly with income terciles, the lowest, associated with slower walking speed. With education, and this is where the earlier embedding of social determinants of the biology of aging is evident with respect to the comparison between primary, secondary, and tertiary education and a functional deficit, such as slow walking speed. And social class, semi-skilled, skilled, non-manual, and professional, again, that association. So a strong association between this function, this necessary function, and social patterning. And the pattern repeats itself if we look at elevated C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker, or depression, or kidney disease, or high blood pressure. There is social patterning. And this is UK data, but it's important to highlight it that the difference in total life expectancy at birth, and within that, years in good health, years in poor health, in the most deprived 10% of small areas in the UK, and the least deprived 10% of small areas. And there is a huge discrepancy of almost 12 years in healthy life expectancy. So life expectancy is better, but healthy life expectancy is also much better in the least deprived 10% of areas. So we know that it's the case for function, we know it's the case for epigenetics, and for health. Here we're talking about disability and diseases that are familiar, like stroke, heart failure, dementia. We've been able to look at activities of daily living and independent activities of daily living in the sample and project future health burden based on the longitudinal trajectories so far in the sample, and determine that the number of people with functional limitations will increase 5-fold by 2040. And that's reflecting issues with physical or cognitive health. So this is a salient, I think, warning to health and social policy. And a question, are our services truly age attuned to accommodate what's coming down the track in terms of age-related health burden? This is European data showing how much multimorbidity, which drives poor health span, drives disability, drives poor mobility, drives poor memory, increases with age. So the darker blues here are 4 or more disorders. And as you can see, they are strongly associated with age. And in the TILDA data, the percentage of respondents with multimorbidities, that's 2 or more chronic conditions here, is about 75% of over 50s. So So this is an issue. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons it's an issue is that our health services are very orientated towards single specialty disorders. And what's this is saying that you have heart failure, but you'll also have a lung problem with lungs, problems with mobility, incontinence, visual problems, cognitive problems, etc. And yet when you're seeing specialists in this area, they're dealing just with one siloed function and disorder, rather than taking a more holistic approach, probably with the exception of geriatricians who do look at the bigger picture. That's their training. But this is in the context from a policy perspective of our services. Are our services, as we've orientated them now, fit for purpose given this? And we've done some analyses on this. In the bigger the bubble, the more prevalent the disorder: high cholesterol, hypertension, urinary incontinence, obesity, thyroid disease, osteoporosis, cancer, Parkinson's, arthritis, asthma. And the stronger, the thicker the line between those bubbles, the stronger the association. And this is of interest for two reasons. It underpins what I've just said about multi-morbidities and their connections and the importance of addressing a holistic approach in terms of disease processes when seeing someone, a patient. But also it raises interesting questions in the context of underlying pathophysiology and what's driving the association between arthritis and high cholesterol, for example. We think it's inflammation, but that's just putting that out there. Or arthritis and high blood pressure. Or arthritis and urinary incontinence. And if we take three common ones there: high cholesterol, hypertension, and depression, and I described earlier on in the study that we not only do self-report face-to-face interviews in the home, which is all self-report, but we also bring people to the health assessment area, which is critical because we can do then objective measures with our participants. And if you ask participants, do you have high cholesterol, or has a doctor ever told you have high cholesterol? Has a doctor ever told you have hypertension or depression? And then measure it. This is the difference between the self-report and objective measures. It's remarkable.
Roseanne, I'm so sorry. This was we're just a little bit over time, so
okay, I'm almost finished. So that's
excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Monish, of unmet need there. And we know that there are about 700 million people with untreated hypertension in Europe, and that these issues of unmet need and multimorbidity are actually much more common in anyone who is a carer, either part of the sandwich generation caring or caring generally. So my question is, healthy lifespan is not keeping up with lifespan, and we have to orientate, I believe, our energy in this space to trying to understand why and compressing lifespan at the end of life. That hence mind the gap. So thank you.
Excellent. And I apologize, Roseanne, I hate having to intervene because it's fascinating.
Oh, no, that's fine.
No, and thank you so much for sharing. And I mean, and the work you've done with TILDA is extraordinary, and just the practical policy implications are really excellent. I mean, it really poses significant challenges to, I mean, not just government, but local authorities around issues around physical space and movement and so on. So thank you for your time in preparing the presentation. And once again, if there are any immediate reactions, there was one question came up. Okay, there's actually a very long question that's popped up in the chat, but there was a short query about the walking speed in that. Yeah. I think that was meters per second was
meters per second. But there's two ways of measuring it, Siobhan, and we use both. It's a test called timed up and go test, and we also, which is usable in the home, etc., and very widely applied. And the other one, we have actually got a sensor, a gait right map, which is a large mat with sensors in it, which gives us much more sophisticated measurements of gait.
Yeah, and Alison is coming again with a really good, and I have to say, when you were talking about how do we cure aging and so on, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's extraordinary. It's relates here to Alison's question. I'm just reading it very quickly there about how older people are seen as a burden. Do we stand any chance of shifting the policy from? Yeah, I guess it's about the framing of aging. So this might be a slightly bigger question again of how we think about this. I'm not sure if there's an easy answer to
there's two things. First of all, honestly, there's not a lot of resource being put into finding a cure for aging. It's been driven a lot by, you know, Silicon Valley resources, etc. So that's one thing.
Synthetic biology is the big thing now, of course.
But I hope I shared the thing about that is that's just going to create even more disparities globally. Okay. So I mean, and then secondly, a chance of shifting Ireland's policy. I think we need to, I don't think it's out there sufficiently that multimorbidity is a big issue and that we have to somehow reframe the way we deliver health and to some extent social care services to incorporate and to take that concept into consideration when developing services.
No, that's really well made. Thank you for these points, and again, thank you to all three speakers for really excellent, not just saying that, I mean, really excellent presentations to kick us off this morning. The plan now is that we take a short break of just over 10 minutes at this stage, I think it is, and that we would come back, at 10 past to hear from Tanja Kirn from the University of Liechtenstein and Freiburg. And actually the presentation that Rosanna has just given feeds really nicely to, I think, what Seán Moynihan from Malone is going to be talking about as well. So please, if everybody wants to just, well, you have your... Okay, welcome back everyone. We'll just give it another 30 seconds to make sure everybody is back from wherever they are. And hello, Tanja. That's great. Nice to see you. You're ready to... Yeah, hi. I can hear you perfectly there. Tanja, if you want to go ahead and maybe share your slides if you have them, and I'll let you know if they're working okay.
So, okay. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, I can if you want to. Oh yeah, perfect. That's excellent. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Great. So I'll listen. I will hand over to you just to welcome you and thank you very much for your time, Tanja. And we're delighted that you're able to present to us here. So I will hand over to you. Just okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind invitation. I will focus on the Swiss pension system, which is a kind of a Bavarian system. It has some similarities with the Irish state pension, and So my name is Tanja Kirn. I'm from the University of Liechtenstein and University of Freiburg. The focus in this presentation is on new social risk. So why do they emerge? So unpaid caregiving often leads to a reduction in paid work. Since the pension incomes are related to the paid work, caregiving might be associated with a higher risk of old age poverty. Within the pension systems, there are some elements of solidarity which compensate for the economic impact of unpaid caregiving. However, some of those elements of solidarity are linked to marriage, and this creates a new social risk due to the erosion of the traditional household formation. So marriages, they became more fragile, more children are born outside marriages, the divorce rate increased. So we have here big shifts in household formation. So what do? We analyze how different civil states influence the extent of vertical solidarity within the Swiss first pillar. And we analyze how a more equal labor market participation of women and men impacts the significance of those redistributive mechanisms. So we use a quantile decomposition to assess the importance of vertical solidarity within the first pillar. And we use a dynamic microsimulation model to simulate counterfactual scenarios with equalized labor market participation of women and men. So just a very brief overview of the microsimulation model which was used. So the model is called MIDAS Switzerland. It's processed on the platform LIAM2 as other models, and it applies a dynamic weighting procedure. It's a dynamic cross-sectional aging model, discrete time model. And the model has several modules comprising demography and education, immigration and emigration. So the rate of immigration, but as well emigration, is comparatively high in Switzerland. I have also simulated disability and the need for care, labor market processes, that's labor market participation, the extent of labor market participation, unemployment, and based on those information, we have simulated public pension or future public pension income, as well as the second pillar, the private pension income. The database which was used was the Swiss Silk data set from 2018, and we have simulated an entire lifespan up to 2070. So the Swiss pension system could be characterized as a beverage type system. It has 3 pillars. The first one is the state pension. This is a pay-as-you-go pension system. The second one is a capital funded second pillar. It's an occupational pension system. And the third one are tax privileged private savings. So with regard to the first pillar pension, the pension income, so the minimum pension income is per year 14,700 Swiss franc. This corresponds approximately to 15,700 euros. The maximum pension is currently 29,400 Swiss francs, and the average pension is 22,500 Swiss francs. So it's important to know that the maximum first pillar pension income is slightly below the risk of poverty threshold. In contrast to the Irish state pension, the Swiss first pillar pension, the AHV, is indexed. We had the discussion in the previous section. The gender pension gap in the first pillar is negative. So the pension income of women are on average like 4% higher than those of men. And this is mainly driven by the pension incomes of widows. The pension system is financed by Social Security contribution by employees, self-employed, and non-employed individuals, as well as tax revenues. The gender pension gap of the second pillar is approximately 47%. The total gender pension gap is 34%. So we can already see that the vertical solidarity is significantly higher in the first pillar pension. So the pension entitlements, they are based on a joint entitlement. income splitting is applied in case of marriage as well as divorce. So this is comparable to the state pension in Ireland. And the survivors' benefits, they are earnings related, comparable to the system in Ireland. So we have various elements of vertical solidarity. So we have interpersonal solidarity. That means a transfer from higher to lower incomes, and this is implemented through the lower and upper benefit limits. There is solidarity for family caregivers, so care credits for childcare as well as care credits for care of elderly family members are warranted. And we have intrafamilial solidarity via inactivity contributions, income splitting, and survivor spending. And those elements of solidarity, which are highlighted in red, they are linked to the civil state of marriage. So, and this brings us to the first research question: how does the civil state affect the extent of vertical solidarity? So the econometric strategy is the decomposition method developed by Freiburg and colleagues. And this is based on the Kitagawa-Oaxaca-Blinder decomposition, where a distinction is made between the effects of coefficients and the effects of characteristics. This approach was mainly used in labor economics, where, for instance, differences in earnings are decomposed, and the effects of characteristics captures differences in educational attainment levels or years of experience, and the effects of course captures in discrimination, for instance, wage differentials between men and women, or between people of color and white, and so on. The KOB decomposition, this is based on an OLS, so it assumes a linear relationship, and as the pension income is highly nonlinear, we apply a quantile-based decomposition, as said, based on the method by Freiburg and his colleagues, where we apply this recentered influence function and determine the recentered influence function per quantile. This is a two-step approach, but I would not like to delve too much into the detail of the econometric strategy in this framework. So what do we get? We can distinguish between intrafamilial solidarity, solidarity for carers, and interpersonal solidarity. And if we have a first look, so the rows, they show the results for singles, married persons with one pension and two pension incomes. Two pension incomes are paid out if both spouses are retired, divorced individuals, and widowed persons. So the results are based on a log-log estimation. So the regression coefficients that are reported here, they reflect the percentage difference between the pension income of women and men. And if we have a look at the first column, we see the results for singles, and we see that here we have a gap in the pension income of 6 6%. And this effect is split up into the effect of characteristics, which captures the impact of difference in characteristics, such as incomes which are subject to the old age pension system, but as well as the number of contribution years or the amount of care credits, as well as the inactivity contributions which have been made. And we have the effect of coefficients. This captures the difference in pension accrual rates, and therefore this could be interpreted as a measure of interpersonal solidarity. That means redistribution from higher to lower incomes. And if we have a look across the different civil states, we observe that extent of this solidarity is much higher for widowed persons or married, in contrast to single persons. So, and if we assume that the traditional household formation will change, or it has already changed in the past, so there will be more singles in the future time, and so we can expect from these changes in household formation that the extent of vertical solidarity will decline. So if we have a closer look at the solidarity for caregivers, we see that if we would consider only the impact or the differences in incomes subject to the first pillar pension, this would result in a pension gap of minus 7.2%. But this impact is mitigated by the childcare and care credits, as well by the pension accruals who are related to those care credits. But if this is summed up, then we see that the effect of characteristics, so lower incomes, are not fully compensated by, for instance, by the care credits. And this is robust if we compare this across those different civil states. We have also analyzed those are the results at the median. We have also analyzed this across the entire income distribution to show how important are those different elements for lower incomes or higher income deciles. Another important measure of solidarity is intrafamilial solidarity. So the pension assessment base of the partner and the contribution years of the partner, for instance, in case of divorce. So the pension assessment base of the partner, this is like split between those partners. And we also clearly see that this reduces the pension gap significantly. So the extent of vertical solidarity depends on the civil state. We see interpersonal solidarity is the strongest element. Singles receive the lowest degree of solidarity. Care credits could not compensate impact of reduced employment. The highest degree of solidarity is observed in case of survivors' pensions and married persons, and income splitting in case of divorce in combination with interpersonal solidarity compensates for the difference in income. So as a takeaway, we can state that the elements of civil law with regard to splitting also matter, not only the design of the pure pension system. So let's have a quick look at research question 2, how intensifying labor market participation of women would affect the significance of vertical solidarity. So the gender over earnings gap measures the combined effects of differences in the employment rate, the employment intensity, so the average monthly working hours, and the differences in earnings. And in Switzerland, the gender overall earnings gap is about 43%. And we use the microsimulation model to equalize labor market behavior at the extensive, intensive, and intensive margin, as well as wage equality. So labor market participation of women in Switzerland is comparatively high, so it's comparable to the Scandinavian countries. So the gap here is not that big, but the hours of work, so there is a lot of part-time work common among women, especially mothers. And if this would be equalized, this would reduce the pension disparity the most. And this has like a side impact. If the working hours would be equalized, this would also contribute to wage equality, since the part-time wage penalty, which is also modeled, it would be reduced. So how affects equal labor market participation the significance of vertical solidarity? The alignment of labor market behavior, here are the results for singles reported, would increase the pension income by 3.1%. Effects of characteristics, they would become non-significant. Well, this is not very surprising. If everything is equalized, then the effect of characteristics will disappear. What we observe is that the effect of coefficients becomes highly significant, and this is mainly driven by the effects of coefficients due to contribution years. And this reflects that the pension accrual per contribution year increases if women intensify their labor market participation. And therefore, so we have, excuse me for skipping back, those are the results for women. We have also, analyzed the same for men from the perspective of men. And therefore, we can compare those two impacts for women as well as for men. And therefore, we can make statements for both. So the equalization of labor market behavior increase women's pension. What's interesting is that the decline in men's pension income, if everything would be equalized, would be smaller than the increase in women's pension income. So we observe a welfare improvement through this equalization. And this is driven by the fact that the more equal labor market participation would reduce the part-time wage penalty. And another consequence out of this is, since the distribution of labor market income is not simply swept between the genders, but distributed more equally, the solidarity elements would be comparatively less important for men with equalized labor market participation than for women under the status quo today. This is also quite interesting finding. So just concluded, do the existing instruments of solidarity mitigate the new social risk? Well, due to universal coverage of the Swiss first pillar, interpersonal solidarity is high. However, the impact of interpersonal solidarity is limited, as the first pillar pension does not prevent old age poverty. Some important elements of vertical solidarity are linked to marriage. However, to the erosion of traditional household types, these elements of vertical solidarity will lose in importance. And additionally, we have found that care credits do not fully compensate for the loss of wages due to reduced employment. And therefore, it could be questioned whether the provision of informal care, in particular child rearing, which contributes to the long-term stabilization of pay-as-you-go systems, whether informal caregiving rather than marriage should receive a bigger extent of solidarity. There are currently some reform proposals in Switzerland underway, which will address those issues and questions. Next thing is about intensifying labor market participation of women. We assume in the base scenario, in our model, that the earnings gap remains persistent or relatively persistent due to the slow rate of convergence which is observed like in the past 20-30 years. But if labor market participation were equalized, the decline in men's pension would be smaller than the increase in women's pension income. Consequently, the solidarity elements would be comparatively less important than under the status quo. However, the demographic change creates financial pressures which questions or could question the elements of vertical solidarity. An important side note is that we have to keep in mind that a more equalized labor market participation would also increase the second pillar pension income of women. And since this pillar is capital funded, it will be not or less affected by demographic changes. So, well, that's the end of my presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tanja. And actually, as it turns out, there's some very nice continuing threads to this about the use of the microsimulations and, you know, issues that Cathal talked about there about the sort of the different social cohorts, like in this case, men and women, and what it might mean, and a really detailed, fascinating country case study. So thank you so much for your time and for presenting that to us. It follows on really nicely. There were a couple of issues came up in the chat there. Damon had a couple of questions about currencies and so on, but if you don't mind, Damon, I think we'll just it's a little bit off the topic of today, and I'm not sure if Tanja's the person to be asking these questions around monetary issues in the different countries. And then Jackie just had a comment. I guess affirming what's been said about more policy relevant discussions about aging economically in terms of caring and community roles. Yeah, no, thanks, Jackie. It's coming out very strongly from the conversations here and the policy implications of all of this. So no specific question there related to your presentation, Tanja, which is fine. But if anybody wants to raise a yellow hand or to unmute and ask a question right now, we're just a minute or so over. So otherwise we might leave it till 12 o'clock. And I'll hand over to our final speaker, who is Seán Moynihan from the organisation Alone. So hello, Seán, and thank you also in advance for your time. I should say, just in case you run over, I have another meeting at 12 o'clock. So my colleague Colette Bennett, who along with Cathal, we were the sort of trio organising today's event. Colette will take over at 12. So in case you see me slip away, it's not in protest or anything like that. It's just unfortunately something I couldn't get out of at 12. So Seán, I can see you. If you say something.
You see some slides?
Not yet. I can hear you. I can see you. So the final.
Hang on 1 second.
Excellent.
Okay, those slides not coming up.
I'm just seeing your screen at the moment, but I see a spinning wheel. Give us a second here.
Okay, okay.
We're not reading your emails or anything like that.
Oh.
So it's your bank account
Nothing
details.
interesting there.
Okay.
Has that come up at all?
Has it come up on your computer? It could be
Yeah,
a
it's
little
coming up as that I'm sharing. You are
no.
screen sharing.
Are you on two screens by any chance, Seán?
I am.
Yeah, I think you're sharing the other screen.
Now, okay, I'll plug out one screen and see what happens.
Great. What we're seeing.
That's something.
No.
No, not yet. Hang on.
Sorry.
No, you're okay. You're okay.
Okay.
Despite years of this online stuff, I still make these mistakes as well. You're okay.
Okay. Hang on. I'll go and share again. Just hang on one second. I'll go back into it. Okay.
Yeah. The sound and video are perfect, which is great, but it's just the oh, this looks better.
Is that it?
And yes,
Yeah.
go ahead. That's
Brilliant.
perfect.
Okay, listen, apologies for that. I hear Colette in the background, so I just want to thank Colette for a start. Around March, said, would you do this in October? And of course, March, you say yes to everything when it's 6 months away. And ultimately around 2 weeks ago where I noticed it in the calendar, so appreciate that. Also, just to thank for the invite and appreciate the chair, because getting through such a broad range of subjects with so much knowledge in the previous speakers is an achievement to keeping it on time. So I'll try and keep to that as well. I think what I realized from listening to the skills and the knowledge that came through, sometimes when we're trying to make policy decisions in the country or make changes, sometimes we're always talking about what we don't know. But what you can see today from the other speakers is the amount of knowledge, in-depth study and research that people have done is really is amazing and to be appreciated. From us and alone, I suppose what we are is a service organisation, so slightly different in some respect. In what we do is support older people to age at home, and I'll go through. We've a network of staff and volunteers right across in every community in Ireland. But I suppose from that, we would then produce a huge amount of information and data about how the cohort we are supporting is aging, and we transferred that into campaigning. And around 2 years ago, we set up research and evaluation internally. So ultimately is to try and produce evidence-based requests to government to change the policies, because we're trying to show the lived experience of those that come in. I suppose this room, more than any other room, realises that over the next 10 to 15 years, 800,000 increase in population. 5 out of 8 of them are going to be over 65. And that means all government parties, like the Just Transition, are going to have to adapt what they do and how they do it. And sometimes I feel the conversation, you know, we talk about an aging population, goes to health and the pension, and then after that the conversation stops. So what we've tried to set out to do, and I suppose in a global terms, our vision of giving people an opportunity to age at home, is also to try with an aging demographic to make sure that those that are marginalised, those who need support, ultimately is we keep it off the front pages and it doesn't become an issue a bit like housing has done in the past. So if I can just now scroll on. Hang on a second now. Mine's not. Oops, sorry. I'm the only one who's done this, huh?
You're okay, Seán. It's moved on the. It's
going to escape. Right. Okay.
Oh, there we go. It's kind of enlarged.
Okay, there you go. All right, brilliant. Okay, so look, I suppose it's important. I love this picture. There's a picture of somebody who's their services, who's in their mid-80s, and I suppose if you have a look from the previous results and how people are living, this is Lily. She's in her early 80s, and she's referred to us from a GP last winter. Unfortunately, through life, her husband passed away several years ago, and she obviously would have some health and frailty issues. So what we would have done is go out, send a staff member out, we do an assessment and a support plan. And from that, we would have found out that our housing conditions, the older people living in the lowest BER rated housings, and our ability, only having, even though she'd worked 40 years herself, she only has the state pension, and she's living on that. So in some ways, she is atypical of how the people we feel age. So we have a situation where we have to try and help out with health, and linking into the health system. She's become slightly isolated, so we've got volunteers involved around support, around visitation, combating loneliness, and ultimately trying to link her into social activities and into that. Also some frailty issues, so trying to link her into the likes of daycare or into other physical activities to try and maintain her current health. But what you can see from that is you have a situation where she's got poor income, challenges around her houses, challenges around her health, and other things going on. And ultimately is she needs somebody like us. What we do is try and help her navigate through complex situations. And like many others in the last few years, and other people have pointed it out, is you know, with inflation, older people really struggle. So the ability to be an active citizen shuts down. I suppose our presentations in anything, I'm always conscious is that we see the world from how we experience it in alone, and unfortunately that usually is around people who need support. And there's two ways people, I suppose, need support. There's those, and again, Roseanne had some great charts from TILDA, those who maybe have been marginalised, poor education or poor income all their life, and ultimately is the effect of that, where we deal with over 60s. The reason being is a lot of people who come to us, their health maybe, or their housing or their finances have failed, or ultimately need support provided that, or other people who through just the journey of life, you know, through bereavement, through poor, we all know our income is all going to drop, through income, through health, and ultimately is through financial issues, end up coming to us for the supports and the coordination of supports that they need. So I think what you can see there is just overall, I suppose, 38,000 people across the country came to us in 2023, and obviously 62 females. I suppose living alone, I suppose, is a risk factor for both your health, your security, for your finances, and for loneliness, all of which ultimately leads people to have more challenging aging. And you can see we would have a higher propensity of people who don't own their own house. I think the national average is around 84%. And for us, the three issues that always come up the highest for us are mental health and physical health, and much more mental health starting to come through. Then there would be finance, ultimately is people living on the basic pension, and obviously energy costs, and where we're very grateful, I suppose, for the interventions of the last few years that have gone through budgets, the once-offs. The reality is from other speakers and from knowledge people have ultimately we would be disappointed that some of this is not more targeted to the people like Lily, to ultimately put a floor under them, because you know, older people in times of inflation were never able to cope with those increases when you've gone beyond on work ages. So I suppose for us, if you have a look at the numbers there, the increase in the number of people we supported in 23 was around 36%. So ultimately, the demand for the supports to live in the community are much there. For us, we would then have an integrated system. So ultimately what would happen is just to describe it, is that 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, we have a phone referral, so people can self-refer, families, friends, acute, primary healthcare, GPs, etc. And ultimately or else people can refer on the phone. That would then go into an integrated system, and the case would be assigned. We try and solve it on the phone if we can, but other than that, then off to a support coordinator. We've one in every community in the country, and ultimately they then would set up a support plan with the older person. So the Lilies of the world, we can leverage everything that's in the community, and we can also then leverage what's done by every government department. Our aim is to bring all government strategies, all government resources, and all the resources of the community voluntary sector through the front door of somebody like Lily. So if we went in to meet Lily about housing and turned out to be huge loneliness or heating problems, then we pivot and deal with those issues as well. And we'd also acknowledge that 58%, our biggest, I suppose, thing we do, I suppose, that we always celebrate is 87% of what people come to us for, that they're assessed for, we solve for them. And then ultimately 72% of that is done within 3 weeks. And that is the power of the community. That is the power of everybody working together. And we operate in the GRAPs to try and coordinate all of that together. I suppose we're part of a bigger aim, which I suppose if people aren't aware of enhanced community care, I suppose it is very much an attempt to get sláinte care, part of an attempt to get sláinte care into action, where ultimately the HSE has hired around 3,000 clinicians into the community. So ultimately is we move into the support into the community. I'm struck, if you look at then this morning, I'm a big fan, there's a model called the 4M model, which is basically and the first thing in that model, it's an American model which is starting to come over here in healthcare. And what it is the first thing is what matters to the older person. Each of us will want to age in our own way, in our own community. And what our priorities are can be different. And ultimately the system has to be sophisticated enough to deal with that. But I think the other thing that's really coming through from this morning and from other mornings is the social determinants of health. I think really powerful from Roseanne this morning about your housing situation having a direct impact on the speed of your walk, direct impact then on your frailty levels, direct impact on what actually happens to you. So ultimately is what's coming through in the research is only around 20% of you aging well in the community is because of your healthcare. People like Lily can go into acute system once or twice a year and actually at times get excellent help. Home is the support there, is the infrastructure there, and ultimately that with the enhanced community care and what they're doing and how we're trying to align with them and integrate with all their services is we're trying to bring the capacity of the whole system to wrap around the Lilies that are up and down the country. So I think from our side, I remember, I suppose, rather than produce an awful more data, what I'd say to you is we would produce a quarterly report. So if you, as we said, we dealt with 38,000 in 2023. This year it'll be over 40,000 people. For everybody that comes to us, there's an assessment and there's a record of what we did and how we did it for them. So ultimately is we building up this evidence and this data picture of ultimately what did people need and was the system working and where the policies that were proposed or in gestation or in action actually getting through to the individuals. So what I'd say to you is they're done every quarter, really worth a good read. There's a deep dive into everything that comes through, and then we can see the emerging needs, whether it's around mental health, loneliness, and loneliness for us is a cross-cutting issue, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Do you know what I mean? It's linked to an awful lot of poor housing. It's linked to an awful lot of poor finance. It's linked to an awful lot of poor health. So I think that's where we go when we produce the research. So, and then what we do, as I said, we're a service organization that's always campaigned. Ultimately is probably, you know, we always put our best ability to be the voice of older people, for those especially who may not have a voice. I think for us, the picture we have of older people is one cohort of older people. There are plenty of older people who are in different cohorts, who are still working well into old age, who are still who are childminding, who are in social activities, who are volunteering, and we would have plenty of volunteers older than some of the people that we're actually supporting. So ultimately we produce a vision from those people that come to us, and ultimately they represent a wider cohort. And I suppose the main themes that would come out would be loneliness, property and finance. So if you look at the blue elements there, what you've really got is the big issues that come out for us. And then what you got then in the greens, I suppose, is the types of policy changes that we were looking for in those areas to make sure that ultimately we are addressing those major issues. So if I just go on from there, I think the one thing I wanted to take stock, and I suppose it's great to see this morning and other great conversations that are going on around an aging population. And I think, you know, politicians, civic society in general understands we have an aging population. But then when it comes down to what do we need to change, sometimes we get silted up or we get stuck. I think what I'd say to you is we're a member of the Age Alliance, which is and we did a scorecard this year. There was a 2013 National Positive Aging Strategy. And as you can see, even if I just take the first one there, is develop an implementation plan for something that is now 11 years ago. It was never created. There was never a budget for it. The key principles of what's in this plan, everybody still agrees, probably needs to be implemented. But ultimately is sometimes from the realization and the creation of a plan, ultimately is how it gets down through the system. So you can see there, again, all the different government strategies, all the different elements of what we're trying to do as an age sector, and ultimately the scores we've given against it. And some of the ones with the higher scores, unfortunately, really is because government's starting to come to the table now on an aging demographic. For us, we realise that we have to work really hard and communicate really hard if we're going to have the changes we need in place in time to respond to that 5 out of 8 in their things grow. So again, going back to the subject around some of the policy asks, I think for us, obviously having adequate income in old age is actually primary to your health and well-being. And so what I'd say to you is the government has committed to benchmarking the pension at around 34% of the average industrial wage, but the reality is we're still well below that. But ultimately what we have is an awful lot of people struggling out there, especially those on their own, who really only have the basics, and they've cut back and they've made a lot of decisions in the interests of staying within budget or staying afloat. But ultimately is in the programme of government to benchmark. They're now producing benchmarking reports, we believe, but they're not being shared, nor are the criteria being shared with the wider country. So ultimately that is critical. We do that. I think earlier on people talk about the pension age, and that for us it should be a choice. Some people will work on, some people won't have the capacity to work on, and we always talk about people in physical jobs, but sometimes people's health and some people their health frailty, other things kick in, chronic disease, long before they want to stop working, and ultimately is we need to have a situation that they are supported. So for us it's a check. We wouldn't propose increasing the way the pension, but we would propose giving people more choices about what they do. But what we're seeing on the ground is a lot more people being forced to work on, or those people really feeling the loss of not having the ability to work on. Housing, I think really, again, go back to Roseanne, it's a nice link. The reality is the standard of your housing, as I said earlier, really links to your health and well-being. I think for us, and people might always think around younger people in housing, I suppose they've been putting in grants and talking about first-time buyers since I was a first-time buyer. And so what I'd say to you is we believe whether you're young or old, it doesn't matter what age you are, if you've got poor health or poor housing or poor income, you're in a situation that we need support. We did a paper post our budget submission, which we put out around housing, and ultimately the scale of housing need among older people. The number of people renting over 65 has gone up 86% in the last census and is rising rapidly. We need a broad spectrum of housing, but we need targets around that. We figure around social housing, older people alone need around 128,000 units over the next decade. And the reality of that is that infrastructure will be there for the next generation and the next generation. And ultimately housing is always expensive when you build it, but it's always cheap in the long run. And ultimately we have to create those housing choices, because without the changes in current policy in this area, we will be heading back into situations where us and thresholds were founded, where older people lived in the poorest houses. Because how do you pay the rent after you retire? And the cost of paying or supporting people's rent far outweighs the cost of actually providing a good pension. Loneliness, I suppose for us, we just wanted to explain, is a cross-cutting issue, and it comes across people tend to cross people and marginalized, you know, in any situation. I think for us, it's a great example of what an NGO has to do to bring about policy change. We set up the Loneliness Task Force with colleagues across all age groups, across all the age groups in 2017, and we produced two reports and supplementary reports since then. 2020, in the pandemic, everybody realized the effect of loneliness. The evidence, the scientific evidence from TILDA, from everybody. TILDA had a report recently called Loneliness Kills. From everybody is so overwhelming that loneliness will shorten your life, and it affects young and old. It's in the programme for government. It's in 3 government strategies, but yet there is no action plan in all those strategies, in public things. So for us as an agency, campaigning for that for several years, with a lot of colleagues here putting in a lot of work. Then in the last 18 months, we set up the Loneliness Task Force Research Network. So we're gathering all the researchers in the area to make sure that everything we ask for government is based in evidence base. But it is a great example of, even though there's overwhelming evidence that this shortened life, where the state, even though it realizes this, it puts it into policy, it really hasn't funded anything, and it hasn't even funded anybody in any government department or a principal officer, anybody to actually take full responsibility for this and even explore the issue. I think on a day that I think the Just Transition Commission was set up, and congratulations to those that were appointed to that this morning. What I'd say to you is, you know, energy poverty, we can all see it there. For us, up to 2 years ago, we never really had to, you know, there was always lower BERs, there was always problem with housing, but it was probably 3 years ago, probably the first winter, where we actually literally had to get into energy credits, get into ultimately a winter response to energy. We all know that for older people, it's a public health issue. The excess winter deaths, you've got a situation that people need to keep warm, and ultimately for their health. But in the first year that we got involved, over €500,000 distributed. And if you look at the likes of Vincent de Paul, so much of what they do is in energy poverty and supporting people in ultimately having the ability to deal with and pay their utilities. And again, we go back to lack of income and things. Like everybody else, I suppose, from a policy point of view, we're probably disappointed that the budget that we've just gone through ultimately didn't target the groups, the likes of the groups we work with, the likes of groups of other NGOs work with. That ultimately is again, older people are not all the same, and not everybody has the same needs, and not everybody has the same support needs. I suppose for us, again, we look at the right to home care. If you take the enhanced community care and that movement, totally delighted to be involved in that, delighted to work with all our community and voluntary partners and all that. But ultimately, the right to home care is the strategic anchor that will help people to age at home, to make sure that ultimately some personal care issues or some practical issues can be addressed. In the past, that has been just a budget capped initiative rather than people getting what is proposed, or ultimately that they've been assessed by a clinician to get. And ultimately, a lot of people, you know, it depends, the scarcity of this depends on where you live and whether there's either resources or whether there's human resources in a lot of cases available to meet the need. But we see this as a huge thing, and we would be part of the Home Care Coalition for the last, when we've provided the secretariat to that for the last 13 years, ultimately campaigning to ultimately get that done. And I suppose we believe that most of campaigning for policy change coming from the evidence-based is by working with all our partners in social care, so we give one voice to government about what we're looking for, one clarity of the lived experience and the problems that we're trying to solve. Colette has appeared, so that's probably my signal to disappear.
You've got one more slide there, have you, Seán?
No, I think the very thing is, I suppose, now that the secret that the general election is actually on this year is out, right? Surprise, everybody. Ultimately they, you know, from a policy point of view and from an election point of view, these would be the elements that we'd be trying to influence in a way of maybe responding to the aging demographic or starting that journey.
Thank you very, very much. Almost a time, Seán. So that's really good. Thank you for that. I'd like to thank all of our speakers. It's been an incredible morning. There were a few questions in the Q&A just asking about slides. So if the speakers wish to send on their slides to Martha in the RIA or to myself or to Cathal, whoever your contact has been, we'll happily PDF them and circulate them to all attendees. So don't worry about that. So now we have an opportunity for questions. So Seán, if you could stop sharing your screen there. And if the other panelists could put their cameras on, we can take some questions from the floor if they come in. Please use the Q&A function to the participants who are still there. That would be fantastic. So there was one that I saw earlier on, actually, if I can ask, and I think I'll ask it of Seán. So sorry, Seán, you're not finished yet. If I could ask, one came in from Jackie. I'd love to see more visibility in policy discussions about the contributions of older people in older age, both economically and in terms of caring and community roles, and the value of both to our societies to counterbalance the challenges of ageing. And I think that was in response to something that came up in Professor Kenny's presentation earlier on. But no better man than yourself, Seán, to bring the voices of older people into the policy space.
I think really, look, I think older people in younger age and as they've aged have always been net contributors to society. And that's why I always say we're our lived experience of those people who really need support. There is another story to tell, you know, and if you look at Age Alliance, you've got people like active retirement, you've got age and opportunity, you know, people like us, because we're dealing with health, mental health, physical health, housing, we never really talk about arts and culture. We never talk about volunteering. You know, we never talk about that contribution, because ultimately the policy changes we're usually trying to deal with are those who are on the more marginalized, or those who basically through the journey of old age have ended up in scenarios where ultimately they've needed support. All of us may need support at some stage, but we do want to be autonomous. So I think it's a really well-made point that ultimately is we've got to stop looking at it as one big cohort. We produce a picture from the world we view, the angle we look at the challenge from. There are other angles and there are other things to celebrate.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And it does actually come back again to Professor Kenny's piece around, you know, like aging isn't a disease. It's something that should be celebrated. It's a product of advances in health and standards of living and all of that stuff. It's actually a really good news story. But thank you so much for that. So looking at some more, lots of comments about the interesting presentations. So thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you so much. Karina, I'm coming to you. And thank you so much for your presentation on the budget. It was really interesting. The budget 2025 distribution was given as a proportionate change in income. So smaller increases in welfare or minimum wage payments, for example, would result in a higher proportionate increase for those in the bottom deciles. What does the distribution of the actual amount look like? And there's a second question, if I can just continue from the same person. Reference was also made to the impact of temporary measures on the living standards of older people on the basis of the ARUP. So that's the at risk of poverty, the SILC data. However, deprivation rates are increasing year on year. Surely that's a greater indication that living standards are actually decreasing. So if we could have your views on that, please, Karina.
Thanks a million. So two very important questions. So taking the first question, the chart I showed you showed the effect of the budget as a proportion of disposable income across the income distribution. So you're right. If you showed that chart differently, if you looked at the actual average amount of gain in euros per week or something like that, the pattern would look different, right? So to get a 1% increase in disposable income for a top income household you need to give them substantially more money than what you would need to give a low-income household to result in a 1% gain. So the pattern would look quite regressive if you look at the euro amounts, and it looks sort of progressive when you look at the effect as a proportion of disposable income if you ignore temporary measures, and less progressive if you include temporary measures. So it's kind of three ways of looking at the same question. I don't think there's a right or a wrong way to show that information. We typically show percentage changes because it can be easier to interpret, because it's very difficult to sort of show in simple terms what the difference in incomes is between all of the different types of household. But yes, the pattern is definitely less progressive if you look at euro amounts. On the AROP rate, so what we've shown is how changes in this budget will affect the proportion of people at risk of poverty, where poverty is related to income, right? So it's only related to income. We're not really thinking about prices here. And the reason we do that is because it's very difficult to simulate the effect of income changes on deprivation. Deprivation is not only related to income, it's related to lots of other things going on in the macroeconomy and to the price level. And yes, deprivation is, I would say deprivation is more informative, but the problem with studying deprivation is you can only really use historic data. So we only have data up to 2022 on deprivation. So we can't simulate what future reforms are going to do to deprivation rates. We can simulate their effect on income poverty rates, and then we just have to sort of be aware of the fact that income poverty is not exactly equal to deprivation, and the two rates can diverge for various reasons. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much for those very comprehensive answers. Thanks, Karina. Get rid of that one so I can see. And for Cathal, I have two in for you, if you wouldn't mind. When we consider whether a cohort fared better or worse, does that consider the impact of inflation across the various timeframes in terms of purchasing power of the more generous time periods? And then looking at the N curve, that graph that you had up, we seem to be net beneficiaries up to about mid-age. I think it was up to about 40s. So as a woman of that age, I'd like to still say young mid-age. We seem to be net beneficiaries up to then, and then net contributors up to older age when pension payments kick in. Has there been any analysis of this data by decile?
Thanks. So both interesting questions. On the first one, yeah, the analysis is actually adjusted not by inflation, but actually GNP per capita over time. So it looks at how generations fare relative to the state of the economy at that time. Are they better off or worse off? So it takes into account both inflation and economic growth. It might actually be interesting to look at purchasing power, so independent of growth, in which case then you would see that later generations would fare better. They'd fare better from the expenditure, but they also be paying more tax. It's hard to say actually what the net outcome would be. Certainly in terms of expenditures, they would be in receipt of more benefits and more expenditures because the economy was wealthier rather than earlier ones, but they'd also be paying more tax. So I actually think it's a good one to look at it more deeply. How do you compare the living standards of different generations? So this work isn't finished yet. We want to understand a little bit more what's happening. And I think thanks for the suggestion that I think we'll look at that. The second one, looking at the N curve, so that's where we see we start off with children becoming net beneficiaries, and then they pay tax. They into adulthood and middle age. Their net beneficiary over the lifetime decreases, and then it becomes a net contribution. And then if they make it to pension age, they become they potentially become a net recipient of the welfare state over their lifetime. So we're asking, has the analysis been done by decile? It's a little bit complicated in that there's lots of analysis of that at particular points in time. At various points, Typically, those parts of need, so families with children or older families, are at the bottom of the distribution, and they shift to some extent depending upon the labour market and the generosity of pensions. But typically they're at the bottom. Although interestingly, I did some work on the squeezed middle. When you factor in housing costs, that many younger cohorts face very high housing costs, often there is a reordering that you get more of the squeezed middle at the bottom, and when you take out expenditures they can't avoid, like housing, like childcare, like commuting. So what you measure is interesting. In my own PhD years ago, I tried to look at lifetime income. So I looked at a single cohort. So I didn't look at different cohorts over time. I looked at what if you lived your life, I think it was in 1994. So if you lived your life in 1994 Ireland, what would your lifetime income look like, and who were the winners and losers? I think this question relates to what it would look like if you were looking at different cohorts and deciles, and it's probably combining the two. So taking the stuff that Tanja did in her work together with the stuff I did to look at where different cohorts would be in these lifetime income distributions. Again, interesting work to do, but it hasn't been done for Ireland. I think it's been done in Sweden. They have data and they have modelling capacity to look at that. But I think it's an interesting question for us. But I haven't done the last bit, but the first two bits have been done. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Tanja, if I can come to you, there was a question. You've answered part of it in the chat, but I'm going to make you answer it live as well, please, because we have time to do that. Is it possible to individualise pension payments for married or cohabitating couples to support women who may be experiencing domestic or financial abuse? And obviously it's not just women, but the data is there that would support that. And you reference pension rates being below the poverty line. What is the gap for first and second pillar pensions? Thank you so much.
Okay, so with regard to the first question, so the pensions, they are assessed on a joint base to take into account income splitting, splitting of contribution years, and so on and so forth. But they are like paid out separately. So it would be possible to pay them out on different bank accounts. With regard to the gender pension gap, the first pillar, we observe negative gender pension gap. So the pension income of women in the first pillar, they are 4% higher than those of men. With regard to the second pillar pension, which is capital funded, the gender pension gap is 47%, as the pension income of the second pillar pension is on average higher. This gap contributes more to the overall gap, and the overall gap is currently about 35%.
Great, thank you very much. If I can please remind participants that we have the Q&A there. If you want to ask any more questions, I am just about refraining from starting to name and shame participants that I know. You know who you are. But while I am waiting for those questions to come in, what I might do, given that we are very, very likely to have an election this side of Christmas, you know, all indicators are that we will, can I please ask our three Irish participants, Tanja, you can sit this way, but feel free to intervene if you wish, what their priorities would be for the next election. And I know, Seán, you had 9, but feel free to give me your top 3 or go through your 9 if you wish. I'll start with you, Seán. Go on.
All right. Yeah. No worries. I suppose the big thing for the whole for the age sector, as we showed you there, is really to get a commissioner on ageing. It's worked in other jurisdictions, especially through the life course we've lived with National Positive Ageing Strategy. If there isn't something outside the system to hold the system accountable, to, you know what I mean, to do that and create those conversations between government, between community, voluntary, employers, everything else is ultimately we feel we won't get far. I suppose the other big thing is as they're starting to revise the housing targets, do you know what I mean? And I know your former Social Justice Ireland, there's one or two here. I remember talking to Seán Healy 10 years ago, and it was supply. And he was putting out numbers in Social Justice Ireland, and all they got was, oh, it's not that high. And now the number of people are proposing is around 20% higher again. So I think for us is really in housing is actually targets. We have an aging population, we have lower house ownership, and we really need to plan for that, because as we've heard from many politicians over many years, over many people, you can't just turn the tap on with housing. So that'd be by the second one there is, and I think then the third one would be the benchmarking of the pension. So people would have housing, income, and then ultimately is a little bit more power to hold the system accountable to ultimately make sure that we do have a national positive aging strategy, or the work on the Commission of Care that for older people, when that comes through in 18 months, there is somebody there to act as an independent voice to try and hold some accountability and some responsibility in the system. Great,
thank you very much. Cathal, in this space, if you were to look for policy proposals in the next general election?
It's a big question. I think if I was to pick one area, I would look at the resilience of the welfare system. We're in a world that's more volatile. So in my own graphic, the scale of the shocks that we've seen in recent times, and as climate change hits, these shocks are going to continue. We don't know where they're going to come from, but we are in a more volatile world than we were in the past. And we saw when the coronavirus came that the system wasn't able to cope with the change in employment for those who were hit by the shock, because the Beveridgean model is really anti-poverty, but it doesn't really replace, I guess, what you would call middle class incomes. It doesn't work for them. There have been some recent reforms to unemployment benefits, which is welcome, but I think we need to think about how the welfare system can respond to those kind of shocks. In terms of resilience around aging, the system, as Seán was saying there, isn't particularly generous. We have challenges and growing challenges as the population ages in terms of old age poverty. And as we start to see the increasing share of older people in private rented accommodation, that's really going to put pressure on the whole welfare system. Our model of pension income presumes that there are no housing costs, really, either social housing or you own your own place. I don't think it can cope with a rising private rental sector. We need to handle that. And then lastly, around climate change itself, there are some incentives in the system, particularly in relation to farmers, from the welfare system, that inhibit incentives to be more climate resilient. So I think if you were looking at the overall welfare system, I would start to think about resilience in those different domains, and to rethink about the structure of the system we have, which was established in the 1970s, really, from the 50s to the 70s, hasn't changed that much since in terms of design, but the world is completely different now. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and certainly the research that Seán referenced earlier on, that Alone and Threshold undertook last year, the year before, definitely paints a very worrying picture of older people in the rental sector and their capacity to sustain that into the future at rising rates. Thank you so much for that, Cathal. Karina, if I can come to you.
Thanks, Colette. I think fairly high on my wish list would be benchmarking exercise. We've already talked about that in some detail this morning. I think the last benchmarking exercise happened before the financial crisis. So things have changed a lot in the intervening period. We've had a financial crisis, we've had austerity, recovery, there's a pandemic, and now we've had a cost of living crisis. In the intervening years, so at some point, particular welfare payments were set at particular nominal levels, right? The state pension was set at a higher level than the job seekers benefit, for example. And in the intervening years, usually what happens around budget time is the minister says, okay, we're going to put X amount on all social welfare payments, right? And it's the same nominal amount usually for all social welfare payments. And that means that the relativities in the system are being eroded. So at some point, it was decided that pensioners should receive more in welfare than job seekers. And since the nominal amount that those payments have been increased by in the intervening years has been exactly the same, that relativity is no longer there. It's no longer the same as it was. So, I mean, I think there's a really, really strong case for a benchmarking exercise now, in particular, since the system has become so reliant on temporary measures over the last couple of years. Those have been really, really important in helping low-income families to escape poverty, but a lot of them have been untargeted as well. So it's really time to move away from that, to have a benchmarking exercise so that we are happy that as a society, we are giving people the correct standard of living. And then if there's, I mean, you know, indexation is an option after that, but at the very least, comparing real policy changes to a system of indexation will tell policymakers what is happening to relativities and to people's real incomes.
Great, thank you very, very much for that. And certainly there have been so many reports on benchmarking at this point and recommendations from joint directors committees to commissions on taxation and welfare. One would hope that there will be something, some move towards that. My friend and colleague, or former colleague, Suzanne Rogers, has a question for the panel. Does the panel have thoughts on auto-enrolment as a policy issue to tackle poverty in older age? And we know that there have been some delays in the implementation of auto-enrolment. So if I can go to, well, Seán, you have your mic on.
I'm obviously first person on your screen anyway, but look, I think from our point of view is look, we all know the level of people who only rely on the state pension, and so anything that over time brings that through. I think the challenge has always been that there's been a situation for us where for some people, you know, we're always expected to try and buy a house, raise a family, you know, and ultimately is in a lot of cases on the average industrial wage of 40,000. The idea that they had the ability to build up a private pension pot big enough to actually influence or ultimately change what their old age would look like. So I think people haven't had the capacity to do that. So ultimately, anything that builds that capacity and gets people involved earlier, we'd welcome. I think at the end of the day, it's like everybody else is, the devil will be in the detail. So I think in principle, really good. I think in some ways we need to, but there's a situation where I think in the language of it, we sometimes feel for the people that we work with that there's been a bit of a blame. Well, why didn't you put more money in pie for your old age? And the reality is that capacity was never there. It was never there. The ability is never there. But hopefully every 10 years, the age cohorts, our income and other things change. So for those coming below, maybe there is more capacity to ultimately auto-enroll earlier and build up some resilience themselves.
Great, thank you very much. Karina?
Much the same feeling really as Seán, to be honest, Colette. I think it's a positive move to help reduce elderly poverty, and you know, there is some ESRI research that's looked at who it's going to affect. So it's predominantly workers, of course, and those tend to be middle to high income households. So no massive poverty risk from auto enrollment. Now, of course, there'll be individual cases where it simply won't suit and people will want to opt out of auto enrollment. The small increment being charged on their income will be too much for them. And so there may be cases where this becomes problematic. But really, I think the international literature shows that the opt-out system is much better than an opt-in system. You know, there's a commitment device there that people tend to observe. If they're opted into something and they can opt out, they tend not to. They tend to stay in it, which is really great for when we're thinking about the current workers and how their income will look when they retire.
Cathal?
Like Karina, I think it's welcome that we're using behavioral psychology in public policy. Very often we focus on what to do, but not the how to do. So I think that's good. We should use it more often. I think in terms of pensioner poverty, this is a essentially private pillar. I think it takes too much time. It takes too long to have an impact on pensioner poverty. Like until you accumulate enough savings, you're not going to have a big enough pot to make a dent in your old age standard of living, really, and particularly how Ireland's has changed so much in the last 20-30 years in terms of what standard of living you can reasonably expect, and the poverty line has increased a lot in that time. I think, like in reports that go back to the 70s, we still need a second pillar, like most other European countries have, that's earnings related, sitting on top of the flat rate old age pension and supported by private savings. I think it will take a long time before private savings through auto enrollment can have that impact, and of course they exclude people who don't have strong work attachment or are mobile between countries and so on. So I still think there is a need for a solid pay-as-you-go second pillar.
Thank you so much. And Karina, I'm going to take this as the last question. If you don't mind, I'm going to direct it to yourself. Mary Harkin, should we be considering changing the tax reliefs on private pensions to promote equity?
So the current system of tax relief on private pensions, so basically you get tax relief at your marginal rate, your marginal tax rate. That means if I'm a 40% taxpayer and I contribution to my pension, I get relief at 40%. If I'm a 20% taxpayer, I get relief at 20%. So it's more beneficial for high income households. So in that sense, it's like a regressive tax relief. And there are certainly equity implications there, because even if I'm getting tax relief at a 40% rate, it's not like I'm necessarily going to pay 40% on that income when I take it out as a pension, because I'll be entitled to a lump sum tax-free amount. And then if it's spread over a long enough period, then I might stay within the 20% band. So I will never pay the 40% on that income that I earned as a 40% taxpayer. So there are equity considerations there. I mean, the argument in favour of standardising tax relief is that it's not high income households that need the financial incentive to save for their retirement, right? High income households are the ones with the available disposable income to decide how much to put away every year and to take advantage of tax rules. It's really low income households that really need the financial incentive to save for a private pension, and there is an argument for equalising the tax treatment of pension. So maybe having there've been calls over the years for a 30% rate for everybody, so everyone's paying the same, or everyone gets the same marginal tax relief on their pension contributions. So I think that's kind of an ongoing debate, and you could argue either way about it. There are two sides to it for sure, but if we are trying to encourage people who will not otherwise save for their private pension, then the current tax treatment is not really helpful.
Thank you so much for that. I know we're about to run over time, but there are a couple of really interesting questions coming in. And actually, unless the panel have particular interest in this area, or not interest, but particular views on this, I'm going to direct both of them to you, Seán, because I know that there's a particular piece of work with yourselves there. So from Porrick Flynn, have the panel seen internationally any particularly exemplar models of housing for older people or mixed age housing, which address the combined issues of affordability, loneliness, health challenges, and desire to maintain agency and autonomy? And then the other question from Jackie there is around the use of language. So how best we can refer to people in older age so as to promote a more positive stereotyping of aging.
Porrick, thanks for that question. You teed us up nicely for hobby horse. I think for us, hidden among our policy ask about housing options for older people is the gap that we have. You either age at home or you go to nursing home, right? 4% of older people age in a nursing home. And if we stay at 4% and don't reduce that, with an aging demographic, we need an extra 1,000 nursing homes, 800 to 1,000, depending on how you add it up, a year for the next 15 years. Now, that's something really older people don't really want. I think it's something that people don't necessarily want to pay for either. And ultimately, what we want to do is every other country internationally has different language. In Ireland, we're trying to set it up as housing with support. In England, it's called, in Europe, a lot of it's called extra care housing. We call it support on the basis of it's a much more empowering word, even though there's care in that. So the idea being is you would build 55 square meters individual housing, ultimately probably congregated setting in one respect, but everybody gets their own front door, built to universal decide, 24 hours staffing on site. And for a certain percentage of those people who traditionally went into nursing homes, we would have these up and down the country, and it would create, in a situation where people may be facing a challenging, we create a positive option in a negative situation. Somebody may be not able to return home, or their current home is too risky or doesn't meet their needs. Ultimately is we have care within that, but we create a situation that is more like their own home and for other people. And as technology and healthcare moves into the community, we would hope what would happen is the ability to take people with higher and higher support needs would come. And ultimately, because a nursing home, and we'll always need them, and they play some positive role within the system, the reality is you do get 12 square meters and it works slightly like an institution because it has to. And I think in some ways we would like to give people more options than that.
And on the language use for older people?
I think for us, we always come down strong. I mean, we again, with the Age Alliance and Age and Opportunity, we're trying to produce a directory at the moment to go to media and to government, ultimately to challenge the stereotypes of how we view aging. I suppose sometimes, our view of older people is nearly rooted in the past. So some of the imagery, some of the language we use is very much stereotyping, and it looks again back to that negative language, that negative things. Aging is a success, and there are plenty of people, as we say, with that net contribution, and there are people out there in older age, whether volunteering for us or whether doing things in their communities or running 5Ks, putting us all to shame every day of the bloody week. So the reality is that's the truth. That's the truth of it. And so what we say is we do need to look at the language here. We do need to basically have a conversation about how we stop stereotyping people, because it's such a broad cohort, older age, 65 to 95. We nearly put everybody in the same bucket and use language for the same. And I guarantee you, when we get to 65, we will be the most sensitive generation to somebody calling us old or stereotyping us. We won't be having it.
It's the new middle age, Seán. It's the new middle age.
Absolutely. I'm the same as you, Claire. I'm still middle aged. Because I'm going to be like that woman who lived to 122. Exactly. But that's the truth. I think the great thing is the next generation of older people will be so much stronger in not wanting to be stereotyped and not wanting that language. And older people are their own best resource.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you to Damon Matthew as well for raising some very important pieces in relation to, disability and carers in older age as well. We know that there's a very high cohort of older people who provide unpaid care work as well. That links in with the income adequacy pieces that we heard earlier on from our panel. So to close, thank you so much to everybody who stayed with us for the duration of this morning's event. There was a huge amount of detail covered and some really, really interesting discussions. So thank you so much. Thanks also to the Royal Irish Academy, particularly to Martha Fitzgerald, who's unfortunately unwell today, which she put in a huge amount of work in the background of this, and to Niamh Frawley, who has stepped in last minute like an absolute superstar. superstar, and to the chair and the members of the Social Science Committee for all of their support with this piece of work. Final thanks, of course, to our expert presenters who've given so very generously of your time to contribute to this very, very high quality event. Thank you. And a reminder to everybody that today's event is part one of a two-part series. Part two, which will be on longitudinal approaches to policy making, will take place on Thursday, the 16th of January, and invitations will issue tomorrow to all attendees and more broadly. So thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Cathal. Well done. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.